Alrighty, so you can see that I have my materials in front of me while I'm working on this project. The colors of yarn that I'm going to use for this section, a palette of Elmer's glue. It's just a bit easier to pour it out. I use a gallon of the glue instead of the glue bottles because those tend to clog a lot easier. And a paintbrush and some scissors to cut the yarn. The paintbrush, first you use to lay down the glue from the palette. So you put the glue in small sections on the paper. If you put too large of a section, it will dry before you can lay down all of the yarn in that section. So the more fresh that the glue is, the better. So I'm putting glue down in small sections, measuring out the amount of yarn that I need, and then cutting it. Once I cut it, I like to lightly press down on the yarn to fully submerge it into the glue using the bottom plastic part of the paintbrush. This way your fingers don't get all sticky and covered in glue, and then you're just using this really precise tool to press down the yarn, as you can see I'm doing here, and make sure that it lays really flat. This is also really helpful because you can press the yarn into the last layer of yarn, or the last row of yarn, so that there's no white space in between the yarn. That's a big thing that I tell my students about craftsmanship for this project. To get good craftsmanship, I don't want to be able to see any white of the paper showing through the yarn, and then I want the yarn to be trimmed really neatly all around the paper. So that's showing good craftsmanship. So as you can see there, to fill in small sections, you have to cut really small sections of the yarn, so just make sure that you have more glue there so that the yarn stays down. And again, using the plastic part of the paintbrush to really press it down and make sure that it stays in that glue. It might seem a little bit wasteful using so much glue, but I promise it's going to give you better craftsmanship, and in the long run it's a lot better because you can push the yarn really close to each other, make sure there's no white space showing, and it'll stick really well that way. Here I'm working on the deer at the bottom. As you can see, it is some smaller pieces, so I'm kind of going in with my fingers and the paintbrush to really make sure that the yarn is being pressed down correctly. And I wanted to lay down whatever was in the foreground first because it was more detailed, like the antlers for the deer, and then work on the middle ground. So I stopped the water, I worked on the deer, and then I went back to the water. That way I could be really sure the length and the amount of yarn that I needed for the water, instead of, doing the water and then having to lay down yarn on top of that where the deer is. So this is probably a pause where I forgot to pause the video, but yes, so now you can see I'm properly measuring out the water behind the deer, and that just makes it so much easier. So if you have detailed things in the foreground, I would recommend doing those first and then going to whatever's behind it. So here I'm trying to kind of weave in the different colors of the water, so you can see there's that one dark line just to blend in that light blue of the water at the bottom a little bit more. With the grass, I didn't have too many shades of green available, so I went back and forth between a darker green and a lighter green just to give it a little bit more detail and some depth, and also to differentiate it from the trees that I'm about to glue on as well. So I'm adding that there, making sure that there is no white space, that I'm trimming it really neatly right up against the water. And even if the size wasn't perfect, I'm using the bottom of that paintbrush to push it up against the other yarn as much as I can so that there's no white space. And then just accommodating the empty space on the other side of the yarn by, making those pieces a little bit longer. You can always go back in and add more yarn, but it's a lot easier to just do it in the moment while the glue is still wet. So here's that darker green that I was talking about, and since I did the pattern of the medium green and light green for the hills, it was a little bit easier to differentiate it from the tree this way. Now I'm adding the other tree in, and this was a little bit tricky because the yarn is more slanted, but I wanted to make sure that the direction of the yarn fully demonstrated the movement of the tree as well. So we're talking a lot about different elements of art in this project. Texture is obviously one of them with the yarn. Line is a big one because you can see all of the lines of the yarn. And then movement, of course, the movement of the yarn showing the direction of the water, the sky, the tree, anything like that. I'm adding the castle here. And you can see pretty easily in this video how often I had to take yarn off of a section that I had already glued down and just keep redoing it until I found the correct shape that I wanted. It's a little harder with those really small pieces because the yarn can unravel really easily if it's not long enough, and then you just have this weird kind of ball of fluff rather than yarn, and it doesn't glue down quite as nicely. So the really small details are pretty hard, but you just have to try and figure out how to get those shapes in that you need if it is going to be a really small detail. Here I'm adding a darker value on the left side of the mountains and then a lighter value on the right side of the mountains, just to show one value and then also a little bit of depth and space, showing distance. Those little sections were a little bit hard to fill in there, but this was satisfying, just being able to fill in large sections as well with the yarn. And again, using the bottom of that paintbrush. So you can put yarn on top of other yarn if you want a second layer, and that's what I'm doing here. So I just laid down a good amount of glue on top of the yarn where I wanted to add those stars, and then cut small enough pieces to create the stars. Same with the eyes on the deer, same with the lights on the castle. I had a really hard time with the eyes on the deer. I didn't want it to look super cartoonish, and they just kept turning out that way, so I just ended up doing strips. And now here is the final image. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed.